Right, so despite issues such as the cost of living crisis, disability benefit cuts and cuts to the winter fuel allowance being what came up on the doorstep, leading to Labour's record-breaking losses during last month's local elections, where they lost 65% of those seats they were actually defending, Keir Starmer is relentlessly ignoring all of that in pursuit of yet more defence spending, a dramatic escalation of defence spending in fact. Framing it as essential to national security, of course, and putting on the snake oil salesman pitch of economic growth going with it. Starmer is set to increase defence spending by an additional £1.5 billion, whilst telling us all, of course, that there's no money left for anything else and cuts are essential, pushing what is now a £6 billion package of military investment during this parliamentary term. Yet this has got very little to do with defending the nation at all. It's about image, it's about legacy. It's about politics. His politics. Starmer, you see, is desperately chasing a Falklands Moment, a decisive military pivot to boost his political fortunes. It worked for Maggie Thatcher, and let's face it, he's cut from the same cloth. It might work for him in his head, so this is a desperate attempt to portray himself as a wartime leader. Only one problem, though. Britain is not at war, and the greatest threats we face are not military, but economic, social, and environmental. And if there is truly any kind of military danger to us right now, it's Starmer's mouth against more powerful nations, writing the proverbial cheques that this country can't cash. Right, so the military obsessions of cosplay Keith means the magic money tree has had a damn good shaking once more. Starmer unveiling plans to pour an additional £1.5 billion that he's magicked up out of nowhere, because of course the country can just print as much money as it ever needs, that is the truth of it, into weapons upgrades and military infrastructure, specifically 6 new weapons and the construction of more explosives factories. Announced in the Murdoch scum, because when doesn't Starmer kiss Rupert's ring and scribble for that hateful rag, he has claimed this is necessary because the UK was under growing threat. But the nature of this threat of his is pretty ambiguous. There's been no credible suggestion that the UK is facing imminent invasion or attack whatsoever. But sure, the preparedness argument will certainly be made by some. OK, fine. The main justification for the ramp-up, as Starmer is putting it, is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a war where Britain is supposedly not directly involved, but has been far more so than we have had any business in being. And any military shenanigans aside, this country, despite having no money for helping ordinary people as life becomes ever harder, wages stagnate and become devalued as the cost of everything rises, at least £8 billion in aid has been handed to Ukraine since Starmer took office, and for the first several months this is working out at £1 billion a month nearly. His government has used the war to justify everything from energy policy to defence spending, casting Russia as a shadowy and ever-present menace, ignoring the fact Ukraine was turned into a US proxy following a 2014 coup, and that this action pushed the borders of NATO to sitting right on Russia's doorstep. The reason that war came about is not all one-sided, but this has, by this point, though, created an atmosphere of heightened anxiety that suits Starmer's hawkish image-making, you see. So it's got to be asked, is this policy about protecting the UK or about enhancing Starmer's own political legacy? Is he doing all of this for himself? Well, let's strip away the justifications and euphemisms here then. This £1.5 billion isn't being spent to defend Britain. It's being spent on offence, if we look at what it's actually going towards. We're being told it's to build bombs, missiles and new military facilities, factories to make said bombs and missiles in. So these new factories are not going to be safeguarding schools or hospitals from a hypothetical Russian incursion or vengeance strikes in revenge for our assistance to Ukraine. They're preparing the UK for a future in which military aggression, not diplomacy, ends up being the preferred language of the state, because Starmer thinks it gives him a boost, and he does love to play dress-up, doesn't he? And while Starmer claims these investments will create jobs and boost growth, there's very little evidence to actually support that. According to the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the CND, increasing military spending has got no measurable impact on the economy at all. Most modern defence projects are highly capital intensive and high-tech with it, so they employ relatively few workers. Ergo, they create comparatively few job opportunities versus other sectors of the society, of economy. The UK defence sector, even when accounting for supply chains, supports only around 200,000 jobs nationwide. That's a tiny fraction of the total workforce. There's, 67 million people in this country, if you think about it. Oxford Economics tried to argue last year in a report they produced for the MOD that military investment could drive prosperity. But as Action on Armed Violence, the AOAV, have noted, The report overestimated job creation and failed to account for opportunity costs. When compared to green energy or public infrastructure, defence spending ranks pretty poorly in terms of both job creation and long-term economic benefit. Starmer claims that increased defence spending will help boost the economy. This isn't actually entirely false. Public investment in defence can stimulate growth, but it depends entirely on how the money is being spent. For example, defence spending can contribute to growth only when tied, as a general idea, to research and development, R&D, because this often comes with broader economic applications. Once you devise something, some technological innovation developed from military R&D, that could then lead to other uses for sustainable materials that they might have developed, or low-emission vehicles, or advanced telecommunications. These can obviously spill over into other more civilian sectors and uses. But Starmer's plan isn't focused on R&D, not for this additional spending. This $1.5 billion is focused on munitions. Bullets and bombs are consumables, they're not assets. They create no productive infrastructure, they generate no long-term returns. In fact, the first 60 days of Israel's assault on Gaza emitted more CO2 than burning 150,000 tons of coal, which is a stark reminder that war not only destroys lives, and is not just economically costly, but it's also environmentally catastrophic. So the costs associated with all of that, knock-on effects, with the damage caused, are not being factored in here either. Moreover, such spending requires massive upfront government investment, which is where, of course, this money has been found all of a sudden, often leading to increased borrowing or cuts elsewhere. And you can imagine we got a good idea what's coming. In this case, the money for defence appears to come from simultaneous reductions in foreign aid, disability benefits, and green industrial development. Where we could invest in humanitarian efforts to mitigate the damage being caused by war, Starmer opts for warmongering instead, more of that. Where disability cuts are a major concern that came up on the doorstep that saw Labour lose all those votes, in part at least, they still clearly aren't getting the message about that because they simply don't seem to care. And as for green industrial development, well, what a surprise it gets cut by a government and a leader who cares absolutely nothing for such major issues. Starmer's spending choices, and they are choices, are rendered even more puzzling in light of Labour's self-imposed fiscal rules, of course. Where's the money come from? She's tightened our belts, hasn't she? Chancellor Rachel Reeves tied the government's hands with a strict set of constraints on borrowing and spending, making it nearly impossible to fund any bold programmes for health or for education or green energy. Yet somehow $1.5 billion more has been found, inverted commas, for military expansion. The fiscal rules don't apply when they don't want them to, and there's always money for war. So such skewed and hypocritical priorities are fiscally incoherent, par for the course many of us might be thinking from Rachel from accounts, suggesting that political posturing is driving the decision-making here far more than any economic rationale, despite attempts to justify matters as such. Starmer's reluctance to speak plainly is another concern. His announcement was vague about timelines. It offered no clear schedule for when the new factories would be operational, or where they were going, or when these new jobs would materialise, and where, and how many. The vagueness suggests this may be more about optics than ever actually delivering anything, even if it does cost ordinary people their benefits and their wage top-ups or their disability support in the short term. Equally troubling is Starmer's hypocrisy when it comes to war and humanitarianism, something even those supportive of this defence spending are having trouble swallowing. He's been vocally critical of Russia's war in Ukraine, yet he refuses to condemn Israel's ongoing atrocities in Gaza, which are a genocide. He can criticise one side in an actual war, but can't call a genocide of 2 million civilians as such because of his pro-Israel leanings. His government instead mulls over cuts to humanitarian aid to fund this defence spending, even as it sends new shipments of arms to the Israeli regime, which it's continued to do and it won't stop, and continues to conduct surveillance for them as well from Cyprus, from RAF Akrotiri. So this moral inconsistency undermines all foreign policy and just contributes to more international instability that he's now saying we need to spend more money on in order to combat, instead of actually dealing with the underlying causes. It also speaks volumes about whose lives this government values and whose it doesn't. Across Europe, military spending has historically been a poor engine for growth. Countries that have heavily militarised, especially without a strategic R&D component, have experienced limited economic returns on it. Economists point out that any growth generated tends to be slow, expensive, and unequally distributed, which is the last thing we need more of in this country. And it's basically a novel way of saying that the shareholders will make a killing, but nobody else will see a whisker of it. The benefits of defence spending accrue primarily to arms manufacturers and their shareholders, entities that already benefit from tax exemptions and massive government subsidies. As arms company profits grow, they are effectively taxed, therefore, at far lower rates than ordinary incomes, further starving the Treasury of revenue, further stoking the unfairness of British society. Even if we accept the premise that defence spending creates jobs, the link between military investment and employment is just growing weaker. High-tech defence systems require fewer workers than traditional manufacturing, and many defence contractors rely heavily on automation. So where are all of these jobs coming from? It will create relatively few of them. Defence investments are unlikely to deliver broad employment gains, and as I mentioned a moment ago, it is a very small proportion of the workforce already. Instead, it's actually more likely that we will face tax increases to fund Starmer's plans, with little likely return on them, par for the course in a nation where millions already cannot afford food, housing or heat, so just kick ordinary working class people even harder. This government might be called Labour, but there's nothing for working class people in that party anymore whatsoever. If the government were truly interested in national security, it would focus on what actually threatens the UK public. Poverty, inequality, the climate crisis, a crumbling healthcare system, investing in green energy, sustainable transport, housing, education. These would create far more jobs and generate meaningful long-term economic growth. Defence spending doesn't raise living standards. All of those other issues, when dealt with as they need to be, very much would. But they don't let Starmer raid the dressing up box for his military fatigues, do they? It also aligns with Britain's international obligations on climate and sustainable development, obligations Starmer's government currently seems set on gutting in favour of building bomb factories. And while the UK must remain vigilant in a changing geopolitical landscape, of course it must. Real security does not simply come from military hardware alone. It comes from resilient institutions, social stability, economic justice and international cooperation, none of which are served by pouring billions into explosives. Keir Starmer's defence agenda is not grounded in necessity, strategy or economic pragmatism. It is rooted in desperation. A flailing attempt to seize control of a political narrative, slipping further and further away and present himself as some kind of a strong leader. But the British public is not calling for more weapons. On the doorstep they are calling for affordable housing, decent healthcare, economic stability. Instead of answering those calls, Starmer is instead stoking fear and militarising the economy further and funding his own ambitions by cutting support to the most vulnerable. His claim that this will boost the economy is not only misleading but deeply cynical. It's not a path to prosperity. It's a costly detour. One that will leave Britain poorer, more divided, more exposed to the real challenges of the future, the people in it more and more fed up, growing more desperate for change as they are, change that Starmer promised and yet flatly refuses to ever deliver. The real threat is not Russia, it is not China, it is not Iran. The real threat, increasingly, is a political class in this country that refuses to listen to us. A Prime Minister chasing ghosts of wartime grandeur while real people suffer. It is time for the public to challenge this misguided man and his daft agenda and demand an economy and a society built not on fear but on fairness in the interests of ordinary working class people and not for craven politicians and shareholders more interested in destroying lives than rebuilding them. For those attempting to call Starmer out, especially when it comes to that matter of Israel and Gaza, though, well, the Terrorism Act is there to be weaponised against journalists and activists alike. But there's been a win against Starmer on this front too, and with any luck it's now going to set a bit of a precedent. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping support the channel at the very same time, which is massively appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.